It always excites me when we get to build a really nice piece. Because we have had a problem. And it's about dang time to fix it. I'll start by admitting that I'm not the woodworker that always has nice furniture around. And I think that's because ultimately I would feel guilty if I had to buy it, and I don't always necessarily have the time to make it. But this has clearly gone too far.
I just realized I'm eating a blanket.
This deteriorating particle board table was left by the last tenant, and it's taken a true beating from the Colorado weather over the years. So this is a perfect opportunity to use some of Fortress's scrap wood. I know that alder and walnut look really good together, and I have both, but the final thickness of the tabletop will be 1 inch, so some of the boards that you see are going to have to be resawn. I don't know if this piece is going to be quite as nice as that beautiful particle board table we have, but I guess we'll have to see. Through my years as a woodworker, I've built a lot of instruments, so I've done a lot of resawing, and the one thing I would recommend is using a really good blade. I used to try blades that didn't have carbide teeth because supposedly the kerf would be smaller, but unfortunately I would get so much drift that in the end I would lose more wood than if I just used the table saw to do it. So the blade I chose is the 1 inch Laguna Resaw King blade, and dude, I'm telling you, I have not had a problem since. A lot of variables in woodworking rely on good decision making, and we can't always make the best decisions the first time every time, because if we did, we kind of wouldn't be learning much, would we? But at the same time, if I've already learned all of these lessons myself, then I feel like it would be a missed opportunity if I didn't share that with you. So to bring everything full circle, you should just get a carbide tipped bandsaw blade and you'll thank me later. It's looking like I have just enough wood. And since those two end pieces are shorter than the middle, I want to check that my radius will still fit in the confines of those boards. And everything fits perfectly, so we can begin milling these boards to a rough thickness. I say a rough thickness because the plan is that we'll leave everything just a skosh too thick, that way we can send the two halves of the table through the planer at the end. And cutting the two edges of each board so that they're parallel isn't necessary, but it does help with the visual balance of the piece. And speaking of visual balance, I tend to have a little bit of perfectionism when it comes to grain orientation and color. And that just might be because I've noticed the difference between a well laid out tabletop and a not so well laid out one. So I think we should be kind to ourselves, take our time, and make sure this art piece is really the best we can make it. Any gapping at the ends like this is not ideal. Matthias Wandel shares that his dad had a tendency to leave joints like this and glue them up anyways, but then over the years his tabletops actually split at the ends. So in this case, I think it makes perfect sense for me to learn from someone else's mistake and pass that information along. Have you ever heard of the debate of whether to put glue on both sides of the joint or one? Well, of course, the only right answer is that you only put glue on one side, if you want the joint to look good. I've just found that if I put glue on both surfaces, the joint in the end looks like it has a glue line rather than a really tight wood-to-wood joint. And I'm a professional. Yeah. But don't just take my word for it. Give it a try and let me know what you think. Because honestly, I probably learn more from you than you do from me. There was obviously two halves to this tabletop, so just know that we did 2 glue ups rather than 1. While those panels are curing, let's get started on the table base. We need to cut some boards to make the 3x3 center pillar. And if you're a longtime viewer, you may have noticed that this project is similar to the Gothic Trestle Table series that I did a little while ago. And a lot of you shared that you really enjoyed that design, and I sure enjoyed building it. So why not add some of those elements, simplify them a little bit, and add some walnut, because without walnut, this isn't a real YouTube video. With the center columns glued up, we can begin working on the flying buttresses or corbels. And in this case, we're going to make a template the old-fashioned way. And it's not that hard to lay it out with a compass and a square. In this case, I could have actually just used cardboard instead of MDF because I'm just going to use it to trace rather than cut with a router. But I like to make things that will take up a lot of space and I'll never use again. So what a perfect opportunity. There's actually a good reason why I'm not using a templating bit with a router, and it's mainly because the bit would actually blow each piece apart because of the grain orientation. And since each piece doesn't need to be an exact copy of the last, I could just freehand cut these and sand each one individually. I had a lot of success doing this during the trestle table build, so I might as well do it again. The bottom and top X assembly will be made of two different boards that are half-lapped. I'm not going to be using any glue in these joints because it's just not necessary. I'm doing a test cut to make sure I'm cutting exactly halfway through before I continue my cuts. Then I can mark and cut the other side, followed by hogging out the waste. And there's a few different ways that I could do this. One way is making every cut with a normal blade and leaving nothing behind. Then I can finish by skimming the joint across the blade to clean everything up. But I think the more satisfying way is making the cuts periodically, then breaking the shims off afterwards. Followed by the same last step. Or you could use a dado stack, a router table, or even a radial arm saw. So there's clearly 1,000,001 ways to cut this joint. I'm just making sure that it's not too tight. Now that the 3x3 pillar is all cured, we can get this thing squared up on the joiner and milled to width, which you'll probably never guess what dimensions they are. I want the full height of both X assemblies and the center column to be 29 inches, that way with the tabletop it'll be 30 inches. And we'll come back to that pillar here in a second, but I want to finish the X assemblies. The feet can be cut to the final length and then the taper can be laid out on each end. This next part may be a little obvious, but I want to share it anyways. We want to make sure we orient these correctly before we do the tapers, that way we don't screw up what side we do them on. I just feel like it'd be easy for our brains to goof up, so I wanted to share that. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not using any glue for this joint because the joint itself will be strong enough. I'm just using one screw to hold it all together. Now we can figure out where we want the decorative cutout to be in the column. By using a flying buttress, I can see where it actually ends, that way I can avoid that area. Then I can square some lines to dictate where my no-go zone is, followed by a center line all of the way around to use with a template. The outside lines will just be a guide for my domino later. Now the template can be marked on every single side. You might see a problem with this. If I cut these sides off, then I actually lose my layout lines. But that problem is easily solved by keeping track of each piece and immediately taping it back on. This will at least be accurate enough for this application. And I also wanted to give a quick mention. If you want to support Fortress, grabbing something from our new store is a great way to do that. You'll also find access to my Patreon while you're there. So I'll put a link below if you want to take a look. Thanks. This would actually be a good opportunity to use a template and a router, but again, I think I'm just going to use the spindle sander because I can whip this out pretty fast. Instead of always worrying about if I'm doing things the right way, I'm really trying to spend more time actually enjoying the different processes that I do. Because finessing these accent cutouts by hand is a lot more enjoyable than using a messy router and template. And you might find that your opinion is just the opposite, which is perfect because this brings us back to the point of you should try things your way and learn things how you want to learn them, because after all, you probably don't want to be a carbon copy of every YouTube woodworker out there. Some exterior grade screws will hold the column to the leg assemblies, but we're going to wait until after finishing to put everything together. It's time to get back to the tabletop, and we don't want two halves, and we certainly need to cut it into a circle. Thicknessing the two halves now will clean up all of the discrepancies and bring everything to 1 inch. This joint is going to be really important, and right now we have a little bit of an opening, which we would never be able to close with clamps because each side is so rigid, but we also don't want to take off too much material, otherwise it would change the dimension of the stripe. And with a few dominoes for alignment, we can get this thing glued up once and for all. I'm using some robust clamping cauls to make sure that the clamps don't cause a permanent bow in the tabletop.
Oh! God damn it, that hurt.
That probably hurt pretty bad, but luckily for him, he won't have to deal with that for much longer because he is unfortunately leaving us. Cody wants to find things that inspire him just as much as woodworking inspires me, and I really can't blame him for that.
Just about that much.
With my router connected to a stiff piece of plywood rather than some adjustable circle cutting jig, I can trust that there won't be any mishaps while I do several passes. I think the problem that some of the other woodworkers have encountered is a slipping jig during the process and then the cut getting screwed up. So you'll often see them do one pass with the circle cutting jig, then cut the excess off with a jigsaw, then use a flush trim bit. But there's no reason for us to do that if our jig can't accidentally adjust. Sanding is one of those things that is easily passed up in woodworking and discounted because it's actually really important. And through the time of teaching someone hands-on how to sand, I've realized that it's actually not that easy. Because you might first get into woodworking and not even realize that you can screw up an entire project by sanding it incorrectly. And more often than not, you're probably not sanding enough. I want this tabletop to have a little bit more of a darker and gothic look, that way it matches the base. And I also may put this table outside during the summertime, so this black trans tint will do two things for me. First, it will unite the two color tones of the alder and the walnut so that they look less contrasty and more gothic. And second, I want to test if the trans tint will protect the color tones of the walnut when it sits outside under the sun, since walnut tends to fade from UV. And I'm actually rubbing it with a wet cloth right now to take away some of the color because I think I went just a tad too dark. I like to use a solvent-based urethane on walnut because it enhances the dark color and grain a lot better than a water-based does. And whoa, I was not expecting the bottom of this to look so good. But back to the finish, I've actually found a water base that looks really good on walnut, but I don't want to share it now because I might do a video on it. So let me know if that's a video that you'd like to see. For the base, I'm using Envirolac products and I'm using a catalyst because I want to test how durable they are outside. So even though these products are made for interior, it'll be interesting to see how they fare. The black tinted top coat will get 10% catalyst added to make sure that it's as strong as it can be, because this type of water-based catalyst makes it stronger and more flexible. While we assemble the base, I definitely want to take a second to thank my patrons. You guys and girls are definitely my cheerleaders, and I appreciate you so much. Thank you. A domino obviously holds one side of each flying buttress, but the other side is just screwed. Some rubber feet will help keep the base off the wet ground if I ever do put it outside. And some widened holes will allow the top to expand and contract once it's screwed on. The last step that I almost forgot about is adding the Fortress medallion. And that would mean that we are officially ready for final shots. Please subscribe by clicking the left icon, check out all of our awesome build videos, and here's another unique video to watch.